This lecture concerns another very important kind of shape, negative shape. It's also referred to as interspace. When artfully considered, negative shape, like object-ground relations, makes the things we draw and the composition itself much more powerful. In addition, it's a great tool that helps us establish accurate proportions. In this lecture, we'll learn to use our viewfinders. We'll see how, when drawing observationally, we can analyze shape, select what we draw, and determine the shape of our drawing using this device. And as will become abundantly clear, this last shape I mentioned, the shape of our drawing, is, in and of itself, a really important one. The drawing materials we'll need are our pencils, erasers, sharpening tools, viewfinders, and clips, and some 8.5 by 11-inch printer paper or a medium-sized notebook. We'll also be using 8 to 10 simple objects like those we used in the last 2 lectures. Pitchers, vases, candlesticks, teacups, wine glasses, all that stuff works fine. Among the objects, make sure you have 2 tallish bottles like those used for wine or olive oil, and 2 small to medium-sized bowls. Make sure one bottle is taller and of a somewhat different shape than the other. It'll also be best if one bowl is a little taller than the other. A group like this one would work very well. We started out by drawing objects, and of course, drawing objects is important, but the obvious stuff is only half the story. So I want to disabuse you of a commonly held and unsophisticated idea about how you go about making a drawing. It goes like this. You look at your objects or subject, like some bottles on a table, a barn in a field, or a group of people at the beach. You copy it, outline it, put in the details, maybe some shading, put in a background, throw in some artistic feeling, and voila, a masterpiece. It's actually much more complex than that, as you've already come to see. In addition to the obvious objects we have to think about, we also have to consider abstract shapes and volumes, aggregate shapes, and object-ground relationships. One of the reasons the ground is so important is that every square inch of the format, that would be the drawing shape, is important, has to be considered. An architect can't just think about the building itself. He or she has to think about how a particular building relates to a particular site. The building has to be considered relative to a whole set of factors, like the shape of the site, its topography, the climate, and many others. We similarly have to think about how what we put on the page sits in relationship to the drawing's environment. At a minimum, we have to consider the edges of the page. That's our maximum building site. You may have already intuited that when working with your aggregate shapes, sensing that they have to relate to the drawing's shape. But there's more to it than that. When artists draw, they're not just drawing shapes to represent things, or even groups of things. They're also considering and drawing shapes which represent the spaces between things, shapes to represent where things are not. And that's because they're preoccupied with the relationship between the stuff, the objects they want to represent, and the non-stuff, the 3-dimensional space within which all the stuff exists. In drawing, all the stuff of the world obviously becomes shape, but the non-stuff, the 3-dimensional space existing between the stuff, becomes specific and expressive shape as well. We call these shapes negative shapes. We could make the analogy to music here. Composers and improvisers are just as concerned with rests, the measured amount of times where no sound event occurs, as with the notes themselves. The spaces help create the sensation of a musical phrase. Without considering the rests, the notes would become a jumble. Returning to drawing. Let's say I have a rectangular piece of paper, and using contour, I draw another rectangle centered in it. The minute I've drawn the internal rectangle, I've transformed the remaining part of the page into a shape, a frame. And of course, this drawing is ambiguous. It could be a drawing of a white label on a white wall, or it could be a drawing of a white cardboard frame like your viewfinder held in front of that same white wall. This is an illustration of object-ground ambiguity. The object could be a white label on the wall as ground, or alternately, the object could be a white frame in front of a white wall as ground. Let's look at this in a little more depth, using a more complex shape, a figure, me. We'll get the camera to zoom in so that the top of the frame touches the top of my head. The sides of the frame touch my elbows, and the bottom of the frame touches my toes. I'm a shape. and my shape meeting the frame automatically creates 7 other shapes. Altogether, 8 shapes that fit together like a jigsaw puzzle to create the image. Our preponderancy to want to see the figure is so great that I'd like to line up the negatives so that you can get a good look at them and understand that each one is a unique shape. If we pull the frame out, the negatives are a little harder to discern, but they're there nonetheless. What's inescapable is that by making a shape, any shape, within the drawing's shape or format, we get other shapes automatically. And if you're not aware of all the shapes you're making in a drawing, you're at a disadvantage. So, let me rephrase something I said in an earlier lecture. I offered this set of directions for making a shape using contour line. Put your pencil's tip on your page. Don't lift the pencil from the page. Draw a line in any or all directions. Don't cross over any line you've drawn. Return to the point of origin. And indeed, you will make a shape, but as we now know, in relationship to the format shape, you actually get at least 2 shapes, and often, depending on the object and its relationship to the format, many more. And here it's worth dipping into a bit of Taoism. Chapter 11 of the Tao Te Ching, a 6th century BCE collection of the teaching of Lao Tzu, it's called Wu Yong. It means worthless. It's a very clever take on the importance of the negative. The writer tells us that the usefulness of a clay pot depends on its empty interior, that the windows and doors are only of use because they contained empty space, and that it's a space between the walls that defines the usefulness of a room. Good artists are clearly aware of all of this, just as composers and improvisers are keenly aware of the relationship between notes or other sound events and rests which separate those sounds. The positive and the negative fit snugly together like pieces of a puzzle to create, in one case, the overall shape of the drawing, in the other, the overall structure of time in a musical composition. In both, taking all the positives and negatives together gives us the full shape of the work in question. In the 2-dimensional visual arts, positive and negative shapes together structure the overall shape of the drawing, painting, print, or photograph. And we refer to this final shape, the shape of the artwork itself, as the format shape. Now, we're now ready to move beyond these abstractions and look at some examples. So, let's return to Aiken's watercolor. Now, I know to the uninitiated, it may look like he was just faithfully representing what he saw, but he's doing a lot more than that. First, we'll zoom in on the figure, just like we did with me. Let's look at the shape between his arm, chest, and knee, or the shape under his bent knee, or the shape between his hand, oar, leg, and the boat. And when we zoom out, we see the larger negative shapes are just as thoughtfully considered. Look at the big shape starting on the right of the page, climbing in steps along the top of the boat, moving up to his back, neck, and head, moving back to the right along the edges where the water meets the land. The shapes between things, the negative shapes, are highly rendered. In other words, they're not left over after drawing the objects, after drawing the figure or the boat, or even the reflection, but they're drawn with as much calculation as the figure itself. I want to take a look at a couple other examples from different places and times. I want to make it clear that this is not about a style or even a type of art. It's an underlying principle which diverse peoples have been using all over the world for millennia. Why? Because you get better results if you pay attention to this. Here's our 2,500-plus-year-old Greek amphora. You can see how carefully each of the shapes that exist between the dancers are weighed and defined. They're given as much attention as the dancers themselves. Here are court ladies from 12th century China. Look at the shape between this woman's sleeve, dress, and the fabric she's holding, or this between the woman's head and the wooden tool she holds. And the larger shapes function the same way. Look at the large shape in the upper right corner, the negative made by the 2 women on the right as they relate to the edges of the format shape, or the shape that occurs between the woman in the blue dress and the green carpet, all very specifically tailored shape. And here's the poussin. Note the tautness of the many shapes on the ground plane between the figures and the figure's shadows, as well as the large wedge-shaped negatives in the sky above that central building. Here you'll get a sense of how being able to see the negative becomes even more important when we work with value. If I want a light building to emerge from a darker sky, I have to be able to form the negative shape around it, draw the negative shape. And if I want a pillar to emerge from the darkness behind it, I have to draw the dark negative abutting it. To make light positive emerge, as Poussin does here, you have to draw the negatives. In the Punjab Hills drawing, we find a similar attention to negative shape. Note the shape between the man's profile and arm, or the shape between the two lovers themselves. And as we zoom out, this becomes part of the large negative shape of the screen that sits behind them. And here's a 1910 drawing by Egon Schiele titled Schiele with Nude Model Before the Mirror. Note the large central negatives between the model's side and arm and reflected hip. Then note the ones formed by the format shape starting on the upper right. Format shape to hat and shoulder. Format shape to underarm, rib cage, hip, and down the leg. Next, the triangular shape between the model's legs. Then, the one between her leg, the reflection of her leg, and Schiele's foot. Next, the rectangular one between their reflected legs. Then, the skinny right triangle formed by Schiele's leg, arm, and the edge of the page. And lastly, the very large shape straddling all three figures and closed by the page's edges. Jumping to the late 20th century in California, we have an example from Richard Diebenkorn. It's a figure drawing done from observation. If we glued that drawing to a piece of masonite, we could neatly cut it up into a set of interlocking puzzle pieces. In much of the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, many artists, both in Europe and in the US, were very interested in ambiguous depictions of space. People like Bonnard, Vuillard, Cézanne, Picasso, Matisse, and Philip Pearlstein, to name a few, all played with this in their paintings, drawings, and prints. And a lot of this interest in ambiguous depictions of space centered on the play between positive and negative shape. Pretty natural. Remember, earlier we noted how a drawing of a label on a wall could flip to become a drawing of a frame in front of a wall. One of the peculiarities of drawing and of the page is that what's in front and what's behind can easily shift back and forth before our eyes. And crafty draftsmen can and do lean on their drawings so that they do just this. We're going to talk about all this at much greater length towards the end of this course, but the drawing we looked at earlier by Giorgio Morandi typifies this approach. You can see how he set things up so that there's a rhyming of shape between the two bottles on the right and their negative, and the bottles on the far left and the right dematerialize into the back wall. Or we could see this as the back wall advancing into the objects. And of course, this drawing and the visual idea examined here relate directly to what we did in our first drawing, the reconstruction of the 80,000-year-old incised piece of ochre from Blombos Cave. Shape sits against shape, positive to negative. And as we saw in the first lecture, the positive to negative structure can be made to flip back and forth. The essential idea here is that the positives and negative shapes taken together form the shape of the whole drawing. Morandi's drawing provides a good segue to our next drawing project. It involves using some simple still life objects to begin drawing positives and their accompanying negatives. We'll need the four objects I mentioned at the top of the lecture, 2 bottles and 2 bowls. Make sure that one bottle is taller and of a somewhat different shape than the other, and that one of the bowls is a little taller than the other one too. I'd like you to line up your bottles so that they're pretty close to and equidistant from the wall. Then, take your tall bowl and put it underneath your shorter bottle, and balance your shorter bowl on top of your taller bottle. Best if both constructions are about the same height. Now, I'd like you to make sure that you have about 2 to 3 inches separating the two structures. That would be at their closest point. It should look something like this. The next step is to frame your still life in your viewfinder. Position yourself so that you're looking straight on. The table's back edge should appear as a true horizontal. It should be parallel to the top and bottom edges of the viewfinder. Also, make sure there's some space, some wall and table above and below the objects. You also want some space between the objects on the right and left sides like this. Once you've got this successfully framed, clip your viewfinder together. Then, lightly with a 2H pencil, trace the shape of the format in the center of your page. Now, before we get further into the drawing, I want to give you some tips on how to use the viewfinder. First, you have to stay in one place, in a fixed position, just like with a camera. If you move backward or forward or from side to side, even slightly, you'll see a different framing each time. That means a different image. You also need to hold the viewfinder at a constant distance from your head. It's easiest to make sure your arm is always fully extended. That way, always the same distance. And you have to hold the viewfinder perpendicular to your line of vision. That's generally perpendicular to the floor. If you don't, the opening will not be a true rectangle. It's going to be a trapezoid. Last, close one eye, always the same eye. Now, I'd like you to draw two light center lines, one for each of the two stacked object groupings. Do this with a lighter pencil, say an H or a 2H. Look out through the viewfinder and try to gauge where the center line of each object would register in relationship to that top horizontal of the viewfinder itself. Then make your vertical lines in relationship to the line representing the top of the viewfinder that you traced on your page. And don't worry if it's not perfect. Dive in and make the best guess you can. We have to start someplace. Now, analyze the objects in terms of constituent shape. Then draw the bottles and bowls as they appear through the viewfinder relative to your center lines. Use contour to draw simple shapes to construct the objects. And don't bother with any details. If they're labels or lettering, ignore them. And don't bother with any shading, it's just going to get in the way. We only want to use contour line and shape. When you need to, erase and correct your lines as you go along. All of this takes repetition and practice. It doesn't have to be perfect the first time, and anyway, it's just cheap paper and a bit of graphite. There's really nothing much at stake. It's a good idea to always keep Degas' advice in mind. You must do over the same subject 10 times, 100 times. And you know, he was Degas. When you feel your proportions are about right, you're ready for the next step. Take your viewfinder and place it on top of your drawing. Close it vertically so that you're cropping the tops and bottoms of both sets of stacked objects. Now, with a 2H pencil, trace the new format shape on top of the existing drawing. Then remove the viewfinder. You should see 5 shapes, starting from the left, alternating positive and negative, and fitting together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. To make the negatives more present, take a 2B pencil and trace over your 3 negative shapes. Make sure to draw the whole shape. On the right and left, it should include portions of the vertical edges of the format shape itself. In all 3, it will include the horizontal portions of the format shape. Next, on a separate piece of paper, copy each of the negative shapes. Don't worry about their position relative to one another. Just try to make a real study of each one. The goal is to draw each negative shape intentionally. On a new sheet of paper, redraw the negatives in their proper scale and position. You can analyze them and build them out of their constituent subshapes. If your negatives are proportionate and in the right locations, magically you'll see the positives reemerge, even though you weren't drawing them at all. Now, let's take the whole thing again, but this time draw the negatives from the get-go. To switch things up a bit, let's move our right stack to the left and the left stack to the right. Also, take the taller bowl and put it on top of the shorter bottle, and take the shorter bowl and put it underneath the taller bottle. But this time I'd like you to frame the still life in your viewfinder so that there's room on the right and left sides of the stacked objects, but the top and bottom of the objects are cropped, just enough to clearly bring out those 5 shapes, 2 positives and 3 negatives. Now, on a new sheet of paper, lightly with a 2H pencil, trace the shape of your viewfinder centered in your page. Look out through your viewfinder and analyze the 3 negatives. What kind of shapes are they? If you want to add a step here, make a study of each negative. On a separate sheet of paper, break each one down into its constituent shapes. This is a bit more difficult than what we've done before because these shapes are less regular and less symmetrical than, well, a bottle or a bowl. Either way, analyze what you're looking at. When you feel you have a grasp of it, take out an HB or 2B pencil and begin to draw your 3 negatives as they appear in your viewfinder. Remember, each negative shape will be made of at least 4 line segments. Make sure you go over the vertical and/or the horizontal edges of the format shape itself to draw the complete negative. Once you've done this, check your proportions. Are the heights to widths of each negative about right? Compare the three negatives. Are they all drawn to the same scale? Lastly, do the objects, your bottles and bowls, emerge in their correct scales? It's very common for things to be off. No worries. Just erase and make your shapes wider or thinner as needed, and use the negatives to help you do this. In coming lectures, we'll talk at length about the methods we use to arrive at accurate proportions, and negative shape is one of them. If we're trying to get the positive to come out accurately, we can use the negatives to check and correct them. Similarly, when drawing the negatives, we can use the positives to do the same. But the negatives, oddly, tend to be easier to see clearly. That's because we don't know what they look like, at least before we actually study them. With objects like bowls or bottles or people, we have preconceived ideas about what they look like. With negative shapes, we have no preconceptions. We can't, because they're not things, they're just shapes, and each one is different. So we really have to analyze this, and this helps trick ourselves into seeing clearly, seeing without bias. As they say, learning to draw is all about learning to see. The overriding notion here is that the positives and negatives fit together like jigsaw pieces, each exactly cut to fit the other. In the aggregate, they extend to the boundaries of the puzzle itself to create the drawing's shape. It's also like that yin-yang symbol. The two large shapes precisely meet and create the larger circle shape of the symbol itself. Let's return to our drawing project. Our next step is to do the inverse of what we did earlier. We'll open up the viewfinder to make the vertical opening larger, so that we can now see the tops and bottoms of our stacked objects. Again, with a 2H pencil, we'll trace the new format shape on top of our existing drawing. Then, with a 2B pencil, we'll draw both a top and a bottom negative shape. On the top shape, we'll reiterate the bottom line just above the existing one, doubling it, so that we get clear shape delineations. And we'll do the same thing with the lower shape, but here, reiterating the top line, for the same reason. Once you've done this, you could try these variations. Though for variety, you might want to get some more objects, candlesticks, vases, pictures, and the like. For one variation, we could include the horizontal edge where the table meets the wall. And you might want to do this first with the viewfinder adjusted so that you're cropping both the tops and the bottoms of the objects. When you do this, double the line representing the edge where the table meets the wall. It will help you distinguish between the bottom shapes that represent the table and the top shapes that represent the wall. Doing this will give you 6 negatives instead of the 3. Then, open up the viewfinder and add the top and bottom shapes, just like we did in the previous drawing. Next, you could repeat this, again maybe changing the objects, but this time start with the viewfinder in the open position. You'll get 2 large negative shapes, though these can be a little harder to see at first. After doing these exercises, you'll likely be seeing negative shapes all over your house or office, because negative shapes are all around us. Wherever you have a space between one object and another, you have a negative shape. The more you study them, frame them, and draw them, the more they'll become an everyday part of the way you see and draw. And after doing the preliminary exercise we talked about, that's just what you want to do. Here are some notes you might find useful as you work through your own drawings as homework projects. Use 1 page for each drawing. Basic printer paper works great for this. Center your format shape in the page and outline it with a 2H or 4H pencil, a hard pencil. This will allow you to modify the format if it will benefit the drawing. Turn your page in sympathy with the drawing's shape. If the framing is horizontal, turn your page horizontally. If vertical, then vertically. Think of the drawing from observation as choosing and framing. Try to choose and frame visual situations that will yield a drawing with strong and interesting negative shapes. Think about what you choose to draw. Art teachers often assign drawings of folding chairs because interesting and complex negative shapes emerge between the legs and from many points of view. But actually, what you draw is pretty unlimited. So spend some time walking around with your viewfinder just framing things as you see them in your bedroom, kitchen, office, bathroom, or other room. Plants often have very interesting shapes between their stems, and between their leaves, and between flowers. If you draw outdoors, look at the spaces between trees, and in a single tree between the limbs themselves. Also, as we did here, try setting things up purposely to bring out the negatives. Part of drawing is finding the right thing to draw for a given project. By looking analytically, you'll be educating your eye. Once you've finished a couple drawings, take a step back and give yourself a self-critique. Here are some good questions to ask yourself. Are your lines convincingly creating negative shapes? When you cover the positives, do the negatives come out forcefully? Are the large intershapes or negative shapes being used to build the composition and assert the rectangular format itself? Are the large negative shapes active? Here are some excellent examples of negative shape drawings from my students at the University of Washington. In the first example, you can see how one bottle has been stacked on top of another object, and the negatives are beginning to emerge. You can also see that there are horizontal lines within the negatives. These are subdivisions to try and analyze the negative. In the next drawing, you can see the negatives emerging even more strongly. The first one has a wider section at the top and narrows to the bottom, and the bottle begins to emerge between those two shapes. In the next example, we have a lamp which is emerging very strongly, but if you really look at the drawing carefully, you'll see that it's made of 4 negative shapes, and we can peel those shapes away, and let's just line them up so we can see each of those shapes clearly. And here's an even more complex lamp, a lamp with 4 heads. And the lamp seems to come very much to the fore. The object comes very much to the fore. But again, let's peel those negative shapes away and just line them up so we can see that the drawing is really clearly made of those negatives. At first, they trick you. You think the person has drawn the object. But when you crop the positives, you see that what has been drawn has indeed been the negative itself. Let's take a moment to sum up what we've learned, and it's all connected. We can make shapes out of contour line. We can create the illusion of volume using cross-contour, oblique shapes, and geometric solids. We can construct objects using contour, shape, cross-contour, oblique shapes, and geometric solids, often with the use of construction lines. We can organize the objects in our drawing using aggregate shapes. Aggregate shapes help us create visual groupings. They contain in place what it is we want to draw within the drawing's shape. We can conceive of the space around the main objects or subject as large flat shapes, ground shapes. These shapes form the shape of the drawing itself. We can conceive of yet another kind of shape which expresses the distances and spaces between things. We call these negative shapes. Our drawings are going to benefit when the negative shapes are as tangible and compelling as the objects themselves. And those negative shapes are also useful for checking the proportions of the positives, the objects.